In this video, we'll work on animating a layered composition in After Effects using forward kinematics. So I've already gone ahead in this composition here and made sure to adjust all of my layer parenting as well as the anchor points of the layers that are going to chain together to make up this character. So for example, on this left arm, I've got the parenting set up as well as the anchor point so that it's going to move the forearm and the hand as it moves. So the goal here in terms of this scene is I want this character to sort of bend at the waist and have his head move towards these two leaves, and for the hand to move up and part the leaves. So almost like the character is sort of peering out, watching something outside of the scene. A couple of key points that you want to keep in mind anytime you're using forward kinematics is that the main keyframes you're going to be setting are on rotation. You might have some position in there, but the bulk of the properties you're keyframing are rotational. It's generally also a little bit easier to do sort of the bigger movements first and the movements that are tied closer to the sort of top of the kinematic chain that you're working with. So in this case, everything sort of works its way up and is parented eventually to either the waist or the torso. So for example, we could look at the rotation on the torso, and we could use that to have the character sort of bend at the waist. So that's probably the motion I would start with, and then make some adjustments to probably the head as well as the arm. So just for good measure, I'm going to shift select all of the layers that are making up my character, as well as the two leaves. And go ahead and just tap R on the keyboard, and that'll bring up the rotation property for every single one of these. So I'm going to click the stopwatch next to any of those rotation properties, and since all these layers are selected, I'll be setting a rotation keyframe right at the beginning of the scene, so that'll give me sort of a reference point of where everything is starting off at. And so I don't need to keep these selected anymore. I'll just click in an empty part of my composition panel to deselect everything. And now let's go ahead and start animating. So like I said, I want to get kind of the broadest movement, which is the torso leaning this way. I want to get that set up first. So let's look for that torso layer. And so you can see here, I can just adjust that rotation since I have set the rotation property to be keyframe animatable. When I make changes, I'm going to get a second keyframe, and that's going to help me transition from that starting pose to the pose where the character's sort of looking, peering through those two leaves. So from there, probably I want to take a look at the head layer and have that rotate up a little bit like that. So that way I get sort of a compound motion. So as the character's torso is bending down, the head is bending backwards. Now I'm getting a little bit of overlap issue here. So again, I can sort of make tweaks. Whoops, not that far. So maybe I don't want this to go quite as far up. So maybe something like that is going to work well. Now, anytime we are working with layers that have a property that we're keyframe animating, we can make adjustments to a keyframe that's been set by lining up the playhead with it. And one thing that's really helpful to do that is to, as we're dragging the current time indicator, is to hold down Shift, and that way I'll snap right to those keyframes. So if you notice, if I even go off just by one frame, it's easy to start accidentally setting additional keyframes, and that just kind of gets a little bit sloppy, a little bit more confusing. So make sure as you're making adjustments to those keyframes that you're actually right on top of them with the playhead. So we've taken care of kind of the biggest, broadest motions in terms of the character leaning over to look through the little opening of the leaves here. I'd like to bring in some motion of the character's right arm, and I want that to happen over a slightly different time scale. So I want the lean in to happen first, and then the arm motion to maybe take a little bit longer. So let's drag out our time indicator a little bit farther down the timeline, and let's go ahead and get that right arm and we can start to move that up. And so here we'll have to pose both the right arm or the bicep, as well as the forearm and probably the hand. So even though we've got that chaining going on, we want these to have like a little bit of independent motion from one another. So let's see how that looks. And so as we're mapping out these larger, broader motions, we can sort of keep going on that track. So maybe I'd also like this left arm to move up a little bit to sort of balance out the forward lean that the character's doing. So let's go ahead and find the left arm. Just rotate this back a tiny bit. And that might even be too much. So you can see we're kind of working our way from the biggest, broadest movements to the smaller and more subtle movements. Probably at the same time, too, I might want to do something with the waist here. So let's see if we can maybe tilt that a little bit. And here we're sort of running up into one of the kind of drawbacks or limitations of forward kinematics. If we think about how this character is situated, we're assuming that the feet and the left knee are on some sort of hard surface, and that's why this character is not falling off into space. And you would expect, in physical reality, as someone's leaning forward, for the foot to be in contact with the ground and for the leg to sort of bend as that move happens. That's something we would have to do manually here. Our forward kinematic system isn't going to anticipate that, so we would need to add some rotation to that right calf, I believe it is. So that's looking a little bit better. But we're getting the general idea is that we are, for the most part, entirely working with rotation keyframes. We are kind of focusing on the biggest, broadest movements as well as the upper levels of the kinematic chain first, and then kind of working our way out towards the extremities and towards the smaller, more subtle movements. So I'm going to keep spending some time working on this and get it all fleshed out to a point where I'm pretty happy with. Okay, so I've spent some time working through setting up a lot of rotation keyframes on my forward kinematic demo here. I'll go ahead and show you the preview. You can see I've sort of fleshed out the motion a lot more. I've added some anticipation and some more subtle motions, as well as working with easing and just some of the timing of the motion. So I'll give you a couple of examples of a little bit more advanced techniques that I've done here, and we can see that with these rotations on the right arm. And so this is sort of one of the focal points of the motion in this scene, is the way that this hand is moving up to part these leaves. And you can see here the keyframes of that motion are kind of staggered, and this allows certain sections to have the hand sort of leading the motion. So you can see here that keyframe on the right hand is coming a little bit earlier than the one that's on the right forearm, and earlier still from the one that is on the right arm. This lets it look like the character sort of moving their hand first rather than moving the arm and that sort of driving the motion. So I've simply done that just by clicking and dragging and moving these keyframes farther apart from one another, sort of staggering them in this diagonal fashion. I've also used some easing on certain frames, and that just helps me get a little bit more natural motion. I like to do that with the graph editor. So for example, the rotation on this right arm, I can click the little graph icon next to that property, jump into the graph editor, and I can see where I've added these easing keyframes to help sort of smooth out the motion, make it a little bit more natural. The last thing I've done here is just added an adjustment layer, and I've added a threshold effect, and that's just going to take any color that's in the layer and turn it to black. So I can turn this layer on, and then I get this nice silhouette, and that is a little bit more in line with the style that I was planning for. Okay, so that's a nice overview of using forward kinematic animation in After Effects.